inaugural program, the Dialogue on Race Original Series, and I will serve as your mistress of ceremony. On behalf of the student leaders, their families, the families of Denver Smith and Leonard Brown, public officials, dignitaries, and those who organized this program, in particular Professor Angela Bell. I would like to welcome you to the 50th anniversary commemoration of the Southern University student protest that ended with the death of the two Southern University students, Denver Smith and Denver Brown and Leonard Smith. 5 decades later, many people have forgotten the tragedy, and many others have never heard of it. Then there are those who would prefer to be remembered that Southern University did eventually get more equitable funding and its own board of directors. But that would land hollow, since it leaps over much of the pain and trauma. But this program title represents the experience of those that were directly impacted by that day. The program is titled A Cold Case Investigation, Episode 50. Cold case because the official attempts to investigate the episode, the event that day, stopped short of a resolution. Episode 50 because since November 16, 1972, each year after marked an episode and an anniversary, marked the anniversary of this episode for those directly impacted. And as the promotional flyer says, today we gather to explore social context. Cold Case Episode 50 is about racial healing, truth-telling, narrative change, and First Amendment education and awareness. All of these components must be included, plus an examination of the role of systemic racism, because you can't solve a problem that has not been fully named. Truth is uncomfortable, but it is necessary for healing. The motto at Dialogue on Race Louisiana is talk is action, and the right kind of talk can lead to meaningful change. As we honor this occasion, and the way these student leaders, who now are accomplished professionals, have requested, they ask us to make this an opportunity, not just an occasion. For what they attempted, withstood over the years, and is working toward for the good of all involved. If not now, when is a good time to call them heroes? It means a lot to me to be joining with you and honoring the student leaders and what they have requested of us on this 50th anniversary commemoration. And recognition of the legacy group of student leaders for their valiant effort and sustained commitment and ultimately bringing about resolution. So now I will bring up the Louisiana State NAACP Chapter President, Michael McClanahan. He will be followed by Professor Angela A. Allen Bell.
Good afternoon. It doesn't take a whole lot to get me excited. When I got the call to participate in this event, I became overly excited, almost to the point I had to call my wife, and she had to calm me down by saying, honey, I love you, I'm gonna pay all the bills, don't worry about nothing. Right? But this is a great occasion. You know, the NAACP will be called on to fight injustices wherever they are, up under a rock, on a hill, in a tree, on a school, city hall. But to come and participate in this event, I think tops the list of things that I've done in my lifetime. I've been the branch president of the NAACP, I've been state president. And this has to top the list of things that I've done because I'm a Southern grad. I love Southern so much, I brought my daughter from a school in Georgia to come to Southern so that she could get the best education that money could buy, especially my money. And so we're hopeful that today more persons will be enlightened about the occasions of the, it was written in the deaths, but as I've done my research, the senseless killing of Leonard Brown, Devin Smith. And so those of you that went to Southern like I did, you will know not only part of the story, but a little bit more of the true story. And so I want to thank those that participated in the awakening. That's what it really is. I want to thank those who shine a light in this dark cloud over the University of Southern. I want to thank those that shine light in dark places where those that participated tried to hide. I want to thank those that went above and beyond to ensure that the stories of those that were never told, it's told. I want to thank my good friend, Professor Angela Bell, who I would take with me anywhere, because once she gets latched onto something, she does not let go. So thank you, Professor Bell, and her students. You know, it's always good to have somebody that you can say, go do, and her students go do happily because they call me all the time. And thank them for that. But thank this governor. You know, this happened in 1972. I forgot to do a little research to find out how many governors that we've been through that did the bare minimum. But we want to thank this governor because at this point in time in history, the light is really on everybody on this particular government, it's on this particular state. And thank the president of the best university in the whole world, President Shields, for coming down, playing a role. He just got here and got thrown into the fire. And Doc, I want you to know, I know how to put out fires too, so I'm with you. Don't worry about the burning, right? And thanks to the Black Caucus. You know, I've spoken with the Black Caucus on a number of occasions about issues, and when I got the call from the 2s and 3s of them, they were just excited as I was to participate, because many of them know what it means to go to old Southern, dear Southern. And thanks to all of you who came looking for closure, came looking for healing, came looking for where do we begin, but better, where do we begin? And so I say, sit back, relax, because today is the day that we will always, that we will go down in history saying, I was there, the right thing was done. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I am happy and honored to give the historical context for the evening. And I want to start with a journey back to 2011, where I was seated in an audience at a program, and a very gentle-spoken man rose and made a heartfelt plea. That day, Keith Weldon Medley made an impassioned appeal on behalf of the late Denver Smith and Leonard Brown. Mr. Medley had 2 men with him on that day, but I did not know their identity at the time. They were simply anonymous figures to me. But my ears heard Mr. Medley's grief, and my heart felt Mr. Medley's pain. The following morning, Mr. Medley did what he said, and he flooded my email with information about this case. And Mr. Medley began that communication by expressing the urgency of the hour. So the initial words of that email says, Professor Bell, I remind you, it is now the 39th anniversary of this tragedy. I was inundated in the days following with communications from Mr. Medley, and that began my studies of the student movement and the events of 1972. I would soon learn through my research the identity of those 2 anonymous figures that sat in the room. It was Fred Prejean and Ricky Hill. My research soon transposed those people, and so later I would find myself describing those anonymous men as legends, revolutionaries, as bold, as visionaries, as patriots. To describe Ricky Hill and Fred Prejean, those anonymous figures in the room that day, and all of the other members of Student United that I have now come to know, it's been 11 years later, and I finally arrived at the conclusion to this story. You see, 1960 marked an over 90-year wait in the equality line for Black folks. Black people were experiencing fatigue, and rightfully so. We were tired of segregation and all the degradation that it imposes. Those of us who had an education felt privileged. We understood that there was a responsibility that came with being a college student at that hour in history. Black students across the state and the country took the reins. The protests and the demonstrations against segregation were ongoing without interruption from the 60s all the way through the 70s. In Louisiana, many of those anti-segregation student protesters were arrested. Of those came 3 game-changing cases from the United States Supreme Court. The first case comes straight out of Baton Rouge. It involves Southern students, and it is captioned Garner versus Louisiana. That is a 1961 case, and I'm honored to acknowledge Mr. John Garner's only heir. Ms. Joan Garner, would you please rise? That was a Southern University law student that led that litigation before the United States Supreme Court. And then it would only be 2 years later that students out of New Orleans from SUNO and CORE would organize and challenge these segregated establishments, and they would too find themselves before the United States Supreme Court in Lombard versus Louisiana. And then in 1965, here we go again, Baton Rouge protesters before the Supreme Court in Cox versus Louisiana. But it's interesting that in each of these cases, the students prevailed. The state of Louisiana was wrong in every one of these cases before the Supreme Court, and there were declarations that their First Amendment rights were violated. So this taught a valuable lesson to state officials. They understood that arresting Black students in Louisiana would not silence a movement. And so in 1968, we get the rise of the Black Power movement. That pacifist approach to social change has now yielded. It has yielded now to a more unapologetic approach for demands. Agitation among Southern University students continues into the 70s, but the objective now shifts. It is no longer about segregation, it is about curriculum changes. And on that point, the Students United said, and I quote, "SU's major function has been to program Black students to later provide the imperialists and capitalists with a reservoir of lackeys to exploit Black and poor people." The Students United also go on to say that Southern must use its resources to address the needs of the Black community. And then the Students United organization argued that Southern must remove administrators. Simultaneously, there is another story unfolding, but these students have no idea that in 1971, the nation has just ratified the 26th Amendment. And that amendment lowers the voting age to 18. And that is obviously a concern when we're protesting and leading movements because politicians feel uneasy that this could influence these young new voters. These students had no idea that there were racial tensions unfolding inside of Angola in 1972. Right outside of Southern, there is a collision between Black Muslims and Baton Rouge police. There were few Blacks in power in Baton Rouge at this hour in 1972. And then on the national level, there is J. Edgar Hoover, a man that many describe as a political pervert, who was at the helm of the FBI. He abused power through COINTELPRO, the secret counterintelligence program that was used to silence Black activists all over the nation. And then these students had no idea that Louisiana formed this Sovereignty Commission in the 60s, and it was in high gear by the 70s. And what was the purpose of that commission? To use state dollars to discreetly facilitate any effort to discontinue segregation. And one of its tactics was to silence Louisiana's activists. And so the plot thickens here. We add to the mix of all of this a brand new governor who is eager to brand an image on his administration. So while Edwin Edwards is fashioning policy in the governor's mansion, the Students United students are doing some policy making of their own. So in October of 1972, the Students United penned a list of grievances, and they asked for changes relative to curriculum. And they asked for changes relative to food service and housing and medical facilities and the lack of equipment in the various departments. And they also took a stand when professors were being removed who they felt were key to student success. And they also drafted departmental councils as a proposed resolution. October 1972, a mere month before this tragedy, there were repeated attempts by Students United to meet with the administration. The administrators avoided them. The administrators were unresponsible if they did not avoid them. Boycotts and protests was the reaction. By late October of 2022, the students began approaching the State Board of Education to lodge grievances. These students, they didn't fight with hashtags. They didn't fight with letters on a shirt. They didn't go stand in line to get a picture at a protest. These students debated. These students consulted. These students studied. They collaborated. They organized and they prayed. And as was the case with the students of 1960, law became the instrument of violence against these students in 1972. So in November of 1972, some of these student leaders were arrested. The charge was obstruction and interference of an educational process or facility. Tensions on campus are now mounting. Police presence on campus is now increasing. The meetings and the boycotts become more and more intense. And by November the 16th, 1972, there is a militarized police response on Southern's campus, and within minutes, we no longer have Denver Smith and Leonard Brown with us. But I also want to not overlook James E. Jackson and Leonard Jackson. And if you are with us tonight, I will ask you to rise. Because when those bullets discharged, these two men also were injured that night. They survived. Thank you, sir, for being with us. And they have largely been written out of this story, but they took bullets also that night, and fortunately for us, they survived. And so after this tragedy, Southern has now closed from the month of November all the way to January of 1973. And during this period, there were 9 students. They were all under civil injunctions, ordered not to set foot back on Southern's campus. A number of them are with us tonight, and they will be honored for those efforts. In doing so, we do not intend to diminish the harm suffered by any others on that day. Nor do we intend to suggest these 9 individuals are the only victims of this tragedy. The November 1972 tragedy visited witnesses who saw this and have experienced lifelong trauma. The faculty and the staff who suffered adverse consequences are also victims. The children of some of these adults who have been impacted from this trauma are also victims. But this occasion seeks to shine a light on the plight of these enjoying students. In 50 years between then and now, little has been recorded about their student movement of 1972. And much of what has been recorded is false, it is unreliable, and it is misleading. Through the use of words like radical and militants and rioting and violent, a false narrative has been created. And that false narrative has outlived some of these students. Today, Keith Weldon Medley is in a battle for his life. In January of 2022, Fred Prejean departed this world. Their work is done now, but the task is not complete. So the work of narrative change, the work of racial healing, the work of reparations and First Amendment education, all of that work awaits. And so I call on each of you to make this an opportunity and not just an occasion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bell, and to hear the powerful things that these students did along the way, and to know that their protest was called, one of the labels that was used to describe their protest was that they were inappropriate. It's hard to imagine the power of what I heard can be labeled inappropriate anywhere on the planet. So now you're gonna hear the uncomfortable experiences from the panel. And so I'd like to before the panel comes up, I would like to invite Southern's president. I'm having trouble with your name. Should have practiced. Professor Shu.
It's humbling to stand up here today. As a young man, young child, I was introduced to African American culture starting about age 7. I grew up in Rhode Island. And I went to live with a family who were graduates of Fisk University and the Mary Medical School. A whole different vista. I remember them, this is in the mid-60s, sitting down and watching the news almost every night, seeing these things roll out. And in many ways sort of inspired their efforts the rest of my life. Admit to not making the sacrifices that some of the people in here tonight. So I say that with a great patient. Today marks a significant and sorrowful day in the history of Southern University and A&M College. This day, 50 years ago, 2 young men, students at this university, tragically lost their lives during a peaceful protest. Protesting for good and powerful reasons. As a result of this day, 9 students who were part of the protest organizing team were issued a lifetime ban from the university. Earlier today, on the campus of Southern University, our students, faculty, and staff held activities to commemorate the 50th anniversary of this tragedy. This morning, there was a program at the site of the protest, followed by a pilgrimage to the student union that bears the names of Denver Smith and Leonard Brown. And a symposium and student roundtable were also held. These are powerful moments. It's no crime for today's students not to be aware of what transpired 50 years ago, but it would be a crime if we didn't step forward and offer them an opportunity to learn about these issues. With these events at tonight's gathering, today marks the beginning of a true healing and reconciliation between the university, the families of these fallen students and these former student leaders. I'm new to Southern University. I arrived July 1. I learned a great deal about Mr. Smith and Mr. Brown from the moment I first set foot on campus, because one of the events was held in the university. And that's when I learned of the events surrounding November 16, 1972. As a young person, I also vividly recall the climate of this country in the early 1970s. I was aware of similar unfortunate incidents at other universities across the South and yes, in the North too. The passion of the Civil Rights Movement, the controversies of the Vietnam War, and the people's response to those events. Now, my passion in higher education is student outcomes and student success, and the way that students contribute to the education at an institution, not just like Southern, but especially so. And students who are voicing their concerns and demanding equality at the university, their university. Their demands were such that they were seeking to uplift the plight of both then current students and future students. And in many ways were successful despite the events of that day in influencing the tides of the times. Thank you to the families and former students who have returned for today's commemorative of those events that happened that day. I would imagine, I can't assume to know how they feel, but I am certain it's probably filled with a range of emotions. But I want each and every one of you to know that we sincerely welcome you back and look forward to the telling of the story of your shared interest going forward. Many thanks to the Southern University Law Center, Professor Bell, for her leadership and work with law students in securing legislation and posthumous degrees for the slain students. And she's currently assisting us in our next steps. I pledge to be a part of that process to help further the honoring of these warriors and leaders. I echo her sentiments that today is not an occasion, but an opportunity. An opportunity for awareness, an opportunity for greater understanding, and so an opportunity for evolution. Thank you.
As we met over the last many months, talking amongst ourselves as to what this 50-year mark should be, the consensus among all of the students was that having a representative from Southern acknowledge this history and assist them and all of the families in using this for something constructive was critical. A second piece of that was to have someone who is a state representative also acknowledge the injustice of the hour. And so I am humbled to represent to you that our next guest came willingly and happy to be here tonight to correct this historical wrong, along with the president of Southern University. So I am honored to be able to introduce our governor, Governor John Bell Edwards, who will now speak to the community.
Thank you all. It is a pleasure for me to be here, except that you never really want to have to be here to do what we're doing. But the reason that it's a pleasure is because it really is very important. And so I have done something, I'm about to do something that I've done only once before, because there's not anything that I can do that is more concrete than this. So I am going to issue an official statement on behalf of the state of Louisiana. to the families of Leonard Brown and Linda Smith, Students United and the the community of Southern University. And we are, you all know this, we're a civil law state, and part of the civilian heritage is that we can do something called an amende honorable. I may probably mispronounce that, but that is what this is, and I've only done it once before, and that was earlier this year. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read it. It will speak for itself, and then I will sign the documents over here. But thank you all for coming out, by the way. And being only 6 years older than this incident, I have to tell you, I wasn't that familiar with it. I just wasn't. And so I apologize for that. But it gives me great pleasure to be able to do what I'm about to do, so that to the extent that the state of Louisiana can try to make this right, that's what we're going to do, because there is no rectifying for not to anyone, especially those 9 students who were told never to step foot on the campus of a Louisiana higher education institution again, and certainly not to those 2 individuals who were killed and to their families. So whereas 50 years since the tragic deaths of Southern University students Leonard Brown and Denver Smith, it is appropriate to recognize an attempt to rectify the historic injustice perpetrated on November 16, 1972. Whereas in 1972, during a national movement to advance civil rights for Black Americans, students at Southern University heroically demonstrated and protested against a system which had long denied citizens like themselves inalienable rights and fair treatment due to them under the laws and constitution of the civilized society. Whereas on the morning of November the 16th, 1972, after weeks of ongoing protests, students at Southern University and A&M College bravely and peacefully gathered in Baton Rouge to protest the disparity of educational opportunities in Louisiana. Whereas on that fateful morning, Leonard Brown and Denver Smith, both just 20 years old, were senselessly and unjustly killed, and a law enforcement officer, who was never identified or prosecuted, fired into a crowd of students fleeing from tear gas. Whereas in the aftermath of the tragic killings of Brown and Smith, the Louisiana State Board of Education unjustly and unduly punished 9 student leaders involved in that protest, who comprised the leadership of Students United at Southern University: Louis J. Anthony, Charlene Hartnett, Frederick Prejean, Donald Mills, Herget Harris, Paul Shivers, Willie T. Henderson, Ricky Hill, and Nathaniel Howard. Whereas it is right and just for the state of Louisiana, by and through its newly elected governor, John Bel Edwards, to make amends to those who were victims of injustices perpetrated by the state. Whereas in